In the bustling heart of the village market, Ruth, Anne's mother, stood behind the counter of her little shop. She was busy selling ripe plantains to a steady stream of customers when a familiar face caught her eye. It was Kate, one of her fellow church members, who rarely visited the market. "Look who we have here," Ruth exclaimed with a warm and joyful tone, her arms opening wide for a hug. "Kate, you decided to come to the market today," she added, as smiles spread across both their faces. "I hope you will be joining us for tonight's night vigil?" Kate inquired, to which Ruth agreed before handing over the plantains to Kate, who promptly left. "Anne, dear, let's start packing. It's getting late, and we need to cook for your father before heading to the vigil tonight," she calmly instructed Anne, who came out to help her carry the smaller plantains inside. As Ruth finally arrived home, completely tired, she was determined not to let her tiredness keep her from attending the night vigil. "My dear, don't you think you should stay home tonight and skip the night vigil? You're so tired. You should rest today. There will be plenty more vigils for you to go to," Dan suggested to Ruth, who adamantly refused. "I've already promised my friend that I'll be there. I don't want to break my word. And as coordinators in the church, it's important for us to lead by example," Ruth explained as she headed into the bathroom to freshen up, urging Anne to get ready too. "If you say so. I wouldn't want to be considered a child of Satan for keeping you from going," Dan responded as he watched his tired wife and daughter Anne head out for the night vigil. Arriving at the church, things went smoothly, and at the end, exactly 5 o'clock, which is the usual time they often leave after the vigil, Ruth held her daughter as they headed home. As Ruth and her daughter reached the road that led to their house, Ruth felt a sense of relief knowing they were close to home and would soon be able to rest. She patiently waited for the cars to pass so they could safely cross the road. Just as Ruth was about to take the first step, an elderly woman appeared seemingly out of nowhere, asking for help to cross the road. Ruth, with her kind and compassionate heart, didn't hesitate to offer assistance. She quickly handed her daughter Anne the bag containing their Bible and instructed her to hold it while she assisted the old woman. As Ruth took the old woman's hand to guide her across the road, a strange and mysterious event occurred. In a blink of an eye, both Ruth and the elderly woman vanished into thin air, leaving Anne standing there in shock and fear. "Mommy, Mommy, where have you gone?" Anne cried out, her voice echoing in the empty street. But it was too early for anyone to hear her cries. Filled with confusion and worry, Anne decided to make her way across the road and run home to inform her father of the strange disappearance that had just taken place. Upon returning home, Anne, tears streaming down her cheeks, poured out the unbelievable story to her father, who couldn't help but find it a little crazy. "Where on earth did they vanish to? I've never encountered or even heard of anything like this before," Dan questioned, his doubt evident in his voice. He headed towards the road, thinking that maybe his wife and daughter were playing prank on him. But when he got there, it became obvious that it wasn't a prank, seeing 2 pairs of slippers on the ground without any trace of Ruth. It's been up to a year now since Ruth's disappearance. All attempts to find her were in vain, as even the police had given up on the search. Anne and her father were forced to live without the woman that brought happiness to the house. But one fateful afternoon, as Anne came back from school, she opened the door to the room seeing her mother who had been missing, sitting inside the room watching television. Anne was so scared seeing her. She looked completely different from before. She was on short jean skirt, a sleeveless top with chewing gum in her mouth. This was completely unlike her mother. She wanted to run away, but the pleasant voice that sounded just like her mother called her. "Anne, my dear, it's your mother. Don't be scared," Ruth said, with fears written all over Anne, who was surprised seeing her mother after all these months. Anne, though scared, mustered up the courage to approach her mother and enveloped her in a warm hug. Her heart filled with joy, unable to contain the overwhelming happiness that filled her being. "After all this time, I've finally found you, Mommy," Anne whispered, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her cheeks. "There were rumors that you were dead, but seeing you standing here, I can't help but feel grateful beyond words. My heart is bursting with happiness, Mommy." Ruth returned Anne's hug, looking at the ceiling and smiling. Late in the evening, Dan came back carrying his suitcase. He knocked on the door, expecting Anne to come and open for him as usual. But who came out and opened the door surprised him. His long-missing wife, Ruth. Dan wanted to run, thinking it was a ghost, but Ruth calmly called him back. "Honey, it's your wife. It's me, Ruth. Don't be scared. I'll explain what happened to you," Ruth calmly said, with Dan afraid, but holding her as they went inside. As I held the old woman's hand to cross her over to the other side of the road, we both disappeared, and I found myself in a place that looked completely different from the world I knew. I was in a room filled with scary old women, all of them smiling at me and urging me to join them in the center of their kingdom. Refusing their invitation, they attacked me with their long nails, causing me great harm. But when I began to pray, they screamed in fear and allowed me to escape. I had been afraid to return for a long time, fearing they would find me in my house, Ruth said, with Dan and Anne listening intently. Though her story seemed untrue, Dan and Anne, overjoyed at her return, had no choice but to believe her, welcoming her back with open arms. As the days went by, Dan noticed a lot of change in Ruth's behavior. Gone were the days when she would wake up early in the morning to pray, cook delicious meals, and diligently clean the house. Instead, she seemed to have lost her usual routine and energy. Now all she did was wake up, freshen up, and put on her skimpy clothes before losing herself in front of the television or drowning herself in the world of social media on her phone. Dan couldn't help but express his concern, often remarking, "This is unlike Ruth." The lively and hardworking woman he knew seemed to have vanished, replaced by a version of her that was unrecognizable to him. As he observed her day in and day out, a sense of worry ran over him, wondering what had caused this sudden change in her behavior. Could it be related to the mysterious encounter she had narrated to them, or was there something else at play, hidden inside the cupboard? One fateful morning, Dan, who had taken on the responsibility of cooking and most of the household chores, woke up to find Anne still asleep, while Ruth was in her usual spot, sitting in the living room, focused on the television. Anne, are you not going to school today?" Ken exclaimed, patting her on the back. Anne woke up, gave a smile, and began removing all her clothes. Dan was shocked. Anne had never behaved this way before. She was a grown girl, a full-grown girl. Normally, she would change into a towel before heading to the bathroom. But now she was naked right in front of him. Instead of heading to the bathroom, Anne completely ran out of the house, with the surprised Dan running after her. The commotion caught the attention of all the neighbors, who gathered to witness Anne seeming to run in a state of madness, with Dan urgently chasing after her. Amidst the confusion, Ruth remained calm, her focus in the television, caring less on what was happening to her daughter. Dan, unable to catch Anne, came inside to get his phone to make an important call for help. As he came through the door, he met Ruth inside the sitting room at her usual spot. "Are you serious? Our daughter is out there, running mad, and you're here sitting comfortably," Ken said, touching Ruth, who angrily stood up and left the sitting room. Dan was shocked by Ruth's lack of concern for their daughter's well-being. He observed her nonchalantly heading to the room to lie down, caring less of what was happening to their daughter, who seemed to have lost one of the nuts in her brain, resulting in her madness. Despite the anger boiling within him, Dan managed to maintain his composure. He quickly grabbed his phone and left the room, determined to take action. Calling on the assistance of a few security personnel, Dan sought help. Together, they managed to get hold of Anne, locking her in a room within Dan's house. They kept her in chains, chaining both her hands and legs to prevent any further escape attempts. It was in the late hours of the night when Ruth awoke, heading to the room where Anne was locked in. As she opened the door and left the room, Dan, who was unable to sleep due to his daughter's recent madness, closed his eyes, lost in thoughts about their plans for the next day. However, upon seeing Ruth sneaking out, he was surprised and confused. Where is she going? And why would she be sneaking out of the room at this late hour of the night? "What's wrong with my Ruth?" Dan said, raising himself from the bed and quietly following Ruth. Shortly, she unlocked the door where Anne was held and entered, gently closing the door behind her. "Oh, maybe she misses her daughter. That's why she's going there to see her," I'm just worried over nothing, Dan said, trying to convince himself to go back to the room. Yet, when he heard a strange sound coming from the room, he decided to go inside to find out why Ruth had visited Anne at such a late hour of the night when she could have gone earlier in the day. Secretly going inside the room, what Dan saw left him shocked. In there was an old woman with an ancient pot in front of her and several other charms placed on the table at the center of the room. The old woman seemed to be incantating as Anne was placed close to the table. Dan was afraid and couldn't understand what was going on before him. Where's Ruth? And who's this old woman? Dan said, trying to figure out the connection Ruth had with the old woman. He watched her doing all sorts of incantations, calling Anne's name as well. When she was about to apply a red substance on the sleeping Anne's face, Dan mistakenly screamed, asking her to stop. It was at that moment that the old woman realized Dan had been watching her all along. Who are you, old lady? And how on earth did you get inside this house? Wait a second. Were you the old lady that caused Ruth's disappearance? And where's Ruth that entered inside here not long ago? Are you the one parading yourself as Ruth all this while? Answer me before I beat the hell out of you, old lady, Dan said, looking at the old lady who was boiling with anger. The old woman slowly started walking up to Dan, who became afraid as she pointed her long nails towards his direction. What should I do now? This woman seems to be dangerous, and I can't just abandon my daughter with her, lest she harms her, Dan said, trying not to be a coward by abandoning his daughter just to save himself. As the old woman approached Dan, she suddenly stopped in front of him. Dan braced himself for the worst, expecting her to harm him in some way. However, to his surprise, the old woman didn't show any signs of aggression. Instead, she expressed a desire to hug him, but Dan refused, taking a step backward. Why would anyone want to harm such a wonderful man like you? You are every woman's ideal husband, caring, responsible, and handsome, the old woman said. I know how much you love Ruth, and that's why I took on her form. Even if I can't be with you in my true form, I can still be by your side, looking just like Ruth, the old woman added, with Dan trying to make sense of who she was and how she knew so much about him. Dan continued to ponder over the identity of the scary old woman when she suddenly blew something into his eyes. Instantly, his thoughts were clouded, and he found himself struggling to recall what had just happened. Before he could gather his thoughts, the old woman transformed back into Ruth. Oh dear, I came to check on our daughter, but she's already asleep. I'll come back tomorrow, Ruth said, old woman, gently taking Dan's hand as they walked back to their room. Anne's mental state was getting worse, with each passing day adding to her madness. Dan's friends suggested seeking help from a pastor, but he always found a reason to avoid it. It was clear that the old woman had cast a spell on him, preventing him from accepting any advice that could help cure his daughter's madness. Things started worsening when the old woman, disguised as Ruth, released the mad Anne from her chains, causing her to escape from the house. This time, no one could locate her whereabouts. Despite the old woman's attempts to make Dan forget his daughter, the love he had for Anne was too deep that it would take time for her to completely erase Anne from Dan's mind. One morning, there was a sudden knock on the door. Dan, who had taken on all the household responsibilities, got up from his seat and headed to answer it. When he opened the door, he was shocked on who he saw. Ruth, wearing the same clothes she had on during the night vigil. She was covered in dirt and had a strong odor. I thought you were inside, watching television. What's going on with your clothes? I don't understand, Dan said, confused on Ruth's appearance. As the noise from outside gathered the attention of the old woman, disguised as Ruth, she came out and was shocked to see the real Ruth standing there. How did she escape? How? She muttered to herself. Dan found himself caught in the middle of the two identical-looking women, struggling to make sense of the confusion unfolding before him.